And personally, I've never really been the biggest fan of Limp Bizkit, but even I could tell that this album honestly kind of sucked. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are going to talk about all those many times that a great band put out an album that fans just hated. I'm talking about bands like Metallica, Blink-182, Linkin Park, Limp Bizkit, Suicide Silence, Avenged Sevenfold, and more. And so in this video, we're going to look at some of those notorious albums that fans hated, try to understand why, and answer the question of, was the hate justified? Were the fans overreacting, or was the album really that bad? But first, if you haven't, check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week. Also, join my Discord. We're up to over 4,000 members now, and there are links to both of those in the description of this video. But first, I want to thank Soundcore Frames for sponsoring this video. Soundcore Frames are Bluetooth audio glasses, which I'm wearing right now, and I have to say they're pretty cool. The earpieces have 4 tailor-made speakers on them, 2 on each side, as well as 2 mics with noise reduction. The speakers are positioned above and behind each ear and driven by a custom audio processor for more immersive sound. And there's also a software algorithm that further enhances the stereo image. The frames themselves are interchangeable with an easy quick release, so you can swap them out for any of the 10 different styles. I personally like these, the tour style, because they make me feel like I'm M Shadows in the City of Evil days. But the Wander frames are pretty cool too. The lenses are also polarized to block out 99% of UVA and B and protect your eyes. They're IPX4 water resistant. You can use them for up to 5.5 hours on a single charge, and you can even customize the EQ using the Soundcore app on your phone. So if any of that sounds cool and you want to check out the Soundcore frames, just hit the link in the description of this video. And let's start with maybe the most notorious example of all time, Metallica's 2003 album, Saint Anger. Which is honestly past the point of being just like a bad album. At this point, it's a meme. That is how much people hated it. And I kind of feel bad for them because this was their 3rd hated album in a row. The first was Load in 1996, which was seen as their attempt at going alternative on the back of the grunge boom that had happened a couple years before that. They also committed the cardinal sin of cutting their hair, the ultimate sign of selling out. And then 2 years later in 1998, they did another album called Reload, which was kind of picking up where Load left off, and yet somehow also even worse. Like, the beginning of the song Fuel is just so awful and cringy that every time I hear it, I want to just hide under a rock out of vicarious embarrassment for the fact that it even exists. Give me fuel, give me fire, give me that which I desire. Although, to be fair, it's not quite as bad as My Lifestyle Determines My Death Style, but still. And I remember back then, among the people I knew, but I think kind of among metal fandom in general, by this point, with back-to-back shitty albums and no sign of any change, I think people had just sort of written off Metallica as just washed up, and their days as anything like a cool metal band were years and years behind them, never to return. And so when they released Saint Anger in 2003, I think people were kind of largely prepared for it to suck, but nothing could have prepared us for this. It was truly worse than anybody could have expected, and I would say over time it has only gotten worse. Like, nothing about Saint Anger makes me look back and go, you know what, actually that album was pretty good. Like, I know a lot of people who listen to some seriously awful metal, and aside from just a few complete absolute weirdos, really nobody defends this album. And so I would say the verdict for Saint Anger is that yes, the hate was indeed justified.
Rock and roll, Saint Anger. That's simple.
And switching gears to something a little bit more on the emo, pop punk, or whatever side of things, we have Fall Out Boy's 2008 album, which I actually don't know how to pronounce, like Folie A Duex or whatever. Apologies to any French-speaking folks watching this video because I'm sure I completely butchered that, but whatever, you know which album I'm talking about. And I think this album is generally seen pretty positively these days. You know, if you look on Reddit or whatever, it seems to be one of actually their most popular albums with the hardcore fans. Maybe because they're comparing it to later albums like Mania and they realized that perhaps they judged it a little bit too harshly, a little bit too soon. But if you were around back then, you'll remember that it was not received well by the fans at the time at all. Like, it was very, very, very unpopular. There was even like a rumor that they got booed off stage when they tried to play some of these songs on their tour. Apparently that rumor is not true. That didn't actually happen, but it does accurately capture how fans felt about the album at the time. And if you listen to it now, you might be like, I don't understand. Why do people feel this way? Like, doesn't sound that different. Well, for context, remember that this was only about a year after they put out Infinity on High, which was one of the definitive albums of that era of emo, pop punk, whatever you want to call it, with some absolutely classic songs on it like This Ain't a Scene and Thanks for the Memories. Which were super popular then, but in time have only become more revered, I would say. You know, if you go play either of those songs at emo night now, people will still just go off. There's not going to be a single person in the room who is not singing along to either of those songs. And so I think it's not so much that this album was bad, it's just that it wasn't that. I hadn't actually listened to this album in a really long time, and I put it on when I was writing this video, and I was like, this sounds like Maroon 5 meets like Elton John or something. And of course, I totally get and respect that they were probably trying to stretch their musical boundaries a little bit, especially because all of them, especially Patrick, had grown as musicians and probably wanted to kind of try some new things. But that is always risky business for any artist. And in particular, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it wasn't, I don't know, but it almost felt like they were trying to do like Panic at the Disco, who were blowing up at that time as well. Almost like the, you know, emo show tunes kind of thing. And that is really just not what people wanted for them, at least not at that time. Like I said, I don't love this album, but I don't think it's terrible either. What I am more offended by during this era of Fall Out Boy is Patrick's choices of headwear. He was really into those hats that you see on like ska fans, fishermen, and Greek guys that drive cabs. Now, with all of that said, was the hate for this album deserved? In hindsight, I would say no. Is it their best album? I don't think so, but it's certainly not bad. It's just kind of okay at worst, especially if you consider it to what was going to come later with albums like Mania, which I think everybody would agree make this one look great by comparison. And next up, we have another iconic band that had kind of a fall from grace, which is Blink-182's 2016 album, California. This was their first album in 5 years and also their first album with Matt Skiba from Alkaline Trio replacing Tom DeLonge. And like I said, this was their first album in 5 years, so people had a lot of expectations for it, especially because the album before it was Neighborhoods, which was a really dark album that felt to me more like Angels and Airwaves with Mark on guest vocals than like a proper Blink album. Which isn't a bad thing necessarily, it just really wasn't what a lot of people expected or wanted from Blink. And so with California, it felt like they were making a conscious effort to go back to quote unquote fun Blink and write stuff that could have been on Take Off Your Pants and Jacket or like the soundtrack to some random forgotten Tony Hawk spinoff on PS2. Which on paper sounds like it would have been exactly what the fans wanted, but in practice, it really just kind of didn't go over well. If you read reviews from the album when it came out, I think the main kind of sentiment that people expressed is that it felt like old guys trying to recapture their glory days in a weird, inauthentic kind of way. Which I understand, but it's kind of like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like, on the one hand, people are saying, why did you change it? Go back to what you used to do that I liked. And then when you go back to what they used to do, they're like, why are you just rehashing the past? You know, what are you as an artist supposed to do? Another thing that I thought was kind of a frustrating piece of criticism is that people said it was overproduced, that there were too many whoa-ohs and na-na-na-nas, which is kind of funny to me because it's Blink, right? It's like saying that there's too many weird guitar noises on a Rage Against the Machine album. I don't know what people were expecting. But with all of that being said, I don't really love this album either. There's really nothing specifically wrong with it. To me, it just kind of feels like a band covering themselves, if that makes sense. Like if you listen to the song Don't Mean Anything, it almost just feels like a remix or like a sound-alike version of Adam's song. Dearest Mom, I'm always here. Which kind of adds up to an album that isn't bad, it's really just okay. There's no real like standout songs or hooks. It's kind of like the later Descendants stuff where all the songs are okay, but there's nothing there that really stands out. There's no one song that it's like, that could be the next big single. There's no big iconic hook like you've heard on the classic Blink stuff that we all fall in love with. It really just feels like rehashed versions of stuff that they did 15 years ago. And let's be real, it's just not Blink without Tom. Matt Skiba is great at being Matt Skiba. I think he's a super talented guy. But the fact of the matter is that there's only one Tom DeLonge in the world. He's one of those people that you really just can't replace. However, I will say that although I found this album kind of a letdown, the deluxe version of it is way, way better. I would definitely suggest checking it out if you haven't. It has a whole other disc of songs that to me are way better than the first edition of the album. Like, I think they should have just released the second disc of the deluxe version as the album, and it would have been way stronger and people would have liked it a lot more. So is the hate for this album justified? Well, as much as I love Blink, I would kind of have to say yes. I think honestly their discography would have been stronger if this album just wasn't in it. And next up, maybe my personal favorite example of this, the most interesting example anyway, is Linkin Park's final album from 2017, One More Light, which was by far the least heavy, most quote-unquote pop thing that they'd ever done. And of course, as you would expect, metal fans being the way they are, they hated it, which is fine. Nobody is obligated to like anything. You know, if you don't like the album, then that's cool. You don't have to say that you do. But what was really ugly about it, very cringe, especially in hindsight, is reading reviews of this and seeing how all the critics are just like tripping over themselves to see who could dunk on this album the hardest, who could shit on it and humiliate the band the worst by saying the nastiest, snarkiest thing about it. Here's an especially good example of that, a really douchey review from Classic Rock magazine. No surprise to see hateful boomer attitudes from there. The whole thing makes Ed Sheeran sound like extreme noise terror. With One More Light, Linkin Park have waved goodbye to rock. All the best, lads. It was nice-ish while it lasted. And that one's like kind of particularly nasty and personal, but it was really like that across the board. This album did not review well at all. NME gave it a 20 out of 100. Consequence of Sound gave it a 33 out of 100. Like, these were really just genuinely awful scores. People hated this album. There's just no other way to put it. And is the hate justified? I would say no, not at all. I think this is a really genuinely fucking great album. In fact, if I had to pick just one Linkin Park album to listen to, it would be this one. No, obviously it's not metal, but so what? Does everything have to be metal? Like, are your tastes so narrow that if a band ever dares to step outside the confines of that, you hate it? Especially considering how good this album actually is if you kind of take off your genre blinders. What stands out to me is the just really genuine emotion in the vocal performances and lyrics. Listening to it now especially, there's just so much genuine pain and sadness that it's almost hard to listen to. And to me, that is heavier than any guitar riff. Like, listen to the song One More Light on headphones or something, knowing that Chester killed himself not too much longer after it came out, and tell me that that's not as heavy and intense as anything you have ever heard. It's brutal.
Who cares when someone's time runs out?
And beyond that, I think like the larger point here is just that, like, to me, the kind of people who freak out whenever a band puts out an album that's not heavy, honestly, I think these people just have unsophisticated musical palates. Being that blinded by genre and like being incapable of liking anything outside of that, to me would be like someone who only likes one kind of food, like that kid they did the Vice documentary about that only likes specifically Kraft brand macaroni and cheese, and that's like literally the only thing he eats.
Like, walking into here, there's nothing in here that's like, oh yeah, I might want to try that. I've tried celery, threw that shit up instantly.
If you're one of those, if it ain't heavy, it's shit people, you are the musical equivalent of that kid. And look, like I said, you should like whatever you like. There's no rules to this. But I honestly think it's just sad if you tap out the second you hear music that's not screaming and chugging guitars and double bass. Obviously, I like that kind of stuff too, but there is so much great music out there that's not heavy that you're really just holding yourself back from experiencing a lot of great art. And this album is a great example of that. I think the way that people reacted to this album is also a good reminder that your words do have weight. I'm not saying that Chester killed himself because of the way people reacted to this album, but you do kind of have to wonder if it played a little bit of a role. And I would encourage people to think about that before you leave nasty comments about stuff. I mean, imagine being the guy that wrote that horrible, shitty review in Classic Rock magazine, waking up and seeing the news that Chester killed himself. You'd probably feel like kind of an asshole in that moment, right? And honestly, for good reason. You should. That brings us to Results May Vary by Limp Bizkit, who were easily the most popular of all the nu metal bands at that time, and coming off of back-to-back #1 albums with Significant Other and Chocolate Starfish, and seemed like they were just unstoppable. Don't get me wrong, they definitely had lots and lots of haters in the media and critics, and other people with quote-unquote good taste who don't actually matter, but fans of Limp Bizkit, the people who actually do matter, loved everything that the band put out, but all of that came to a screeching halt with the release of this album, which absolutely nobody liked. Not the fans, not the critics. There was nobody out there giving this album a 10, or even an 8, or a 7, or a 6. Like, it was destroyed by everybody from Entertainment Weekly and Rolling Stone. It even got a score of 0 from Alternative Press, which I'm not sure I have ever seen before or since. That's how much people hated this album. And personally, I've never really been the biggest fan of Limp Bizkit, but even I could tell that this album honestly kind of sucked. With the exception of the song Give Me the Mic, which I actually think is one of their better songs.
Loaded with the vice grip, popping all your copies, you keep watering down shit. Thinking you can rap with that artificial outfit. Your baggy pants and your bottle of crackers. Fuck all of that shit.
I can see why people didn't like it. I mean, like, the album is pretty much full of these like slow, low energy, boring songs with none of the parts or energy that made Limp Bizkit take off in the first place. Like, you can say that Limp Bizkit is corny all you want, and I would probably agree with you. Like I said, I was never really a fan, but their energy is undeniable. Anybody who says that they don't sing along to Nookie or break stuff when they come on is either lying to you or this person has no soul, because both of those songs are certified bangers, and I don't give a fuck what anybody says.
It's just one of those days where you don't want to wake up. Everybody sucks.
Whereas this album was really just missing that same kind of energy and those kind of songs. And the reason why is obvious, that this is the first album without Wes Borland, so Fred Durst was kind of driving the ship creatively, and let's be honest, Fred Durst is not a great musician. I would say he's a really good frontman, he's a very charismatic guy, I think he's really intelligent, but he's not a fantastic musician. And losing Wes really highlighted that and showed that he was really kind of the driving force behind the band's most interesting creative music. The Wes Borland fanboys are kind of annoying, but they aren't wrong. Wes really was what made Limp Bizkit's music stand out, like that weird riff in Nookie.
I did it all for the nookie. Come on, the nookie. Come on, so you can take that cookie and stick it up your head. Stick it up your head.
He's just another one of these people that you really can't replace in a band, and without him, it just wasn't the same. So was the hate for this album justified? I think it was. This album isn't the worst thing I've ever heard, but honestly, really nothing about it is good other than John Otto's drumming, which I will forever love. Alright, well, moving on, let's turn back the clock about 20 years to In Reverie by Saves the Day. This came out in 2003, I believe. They were coming off the release of Say What You Are, which is an almost perfect early 2000s emo album.
This song will become the anthem of.
I personally liked Through Being Cool a little bit better, which was their previous album. But personal opinion aside, Stay What You Are is a 10 out of 10 album for the genre any way you want to look at it. Absolute classic. And pretty much everybody loved it. I remember At Your Funeral was getting a pretty decent amount of MTV airplay. Critics were into it, and it kind of seemed like maybe they would be the next Dashboard Confessional, the next emo band to break through into that like level of mainstream success. And in a parallel universe, maybe they would have, except that in this universe, they put out In Reverie, which pretty much stopped their momentum in its tracks.
I can't come near you every time I do.
I found this random person's review, which is pretty blunt, but I think actually puts it well. The first thing I thought when I bought this was, what the hell? The songs all sound the same, his vocals are annoying, and there's no energy behind their songs. Which, as somebody who loved the band at the time, that was my exact reaction as well, especially to the vocals. I was like, what? Like, this sounds like a mistake. It's almost like at a show when the monitors go out and the singer can't hear themselves, so they're like pitchy and all over the place. That's what it sounded like to me. And actually I hadn't heard this album in years, and so I was kind of wondering how it would hold up, but listening to it again while I was writing this video, I was like, yep, it's actually just as bad as I remembered it being back in the day. So I would say that yes, the hate was justified, and you really have to wonder what would have happened. Like, how big could Saves the Day have been if Chris didn't just kind of lose the plot with this album? And last but not least, Hail to the King by Avenged Sevenfold. A band that was already hated by the metal snobs, but this album only intensified it. This came out in 2013, and I remember the narrative at the time was that this was some sort of huge shift for the band. Like, this was their attempt at copying Metallica's Black album, which honestly it probably was to some extent. Like, just listen to the production on the album, for example. Like, it's obvious that that was their reference.
Watch your tongue or have it cut from your head.
But A, everybody in metal references that mix because it's fucking incredible and still sounds amazing to this day. And B, other than that, it pretty much still sounds like Avenged Sevenfold. Maybe a little bit slower and less intricate than some of their older stuff, but not like a different band or anything like that. I think a lot of the differences that you hear probably have to do with their drummer. This was their only one with Aaron on it, who, as they've talked about in interviews, is more of like a metal drummer than a punk drummer as compared to the Rev or Brooks Wackerman. So I think a lot of the differences that you're hearing are because of that, rather than them like trying to copy the Black album or anything. But either way, I think the reaction was kind of ridiculous. Like, is it their best album? Definitely not. Like, I would put it probably second to last if I had to rank their albums, with the worst one being Sounding the Seventh Trumpet. But even so, the second worst Avenged Sevenfold album is still pretty fucking good because everything the band has put out is great. So as to whether the hate is justified, I would say no. I think the reaction was way overblown. I think that more than anything else, it was just metal nerds looking for yet another reason to hate the band. Alright my friends, that does it for this video about albums that the fans hated. Let me know if you'd like to see another edition of this video, because there's lots more albums that I couldn't fit into this one. Let me know what you think in the comments. Check me out on Twitch and Discord. There's links to both of those in the description of this video. And as always, I want to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get every podcast a week early. There are members only channels in the Discord that I'm super active in. I do giveaways, I do Q&As. There's also a way to have me review your music or artwork or anything else you want to get my eyes or ears on. So if any of that sounds cool to you, you can check that out at the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm gonna sign off for now, but I will see you next time. And also, I want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. And again, shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video.